Federal Labor has vowed to establish a Senate inquiry into the Defence Force's use of anti-malarial drugs in clinical trials more than 15 years ago. The drugs, mefloquine and tafe, were given to Army personnel to trial between 1999 and 2002, including in Timor-Leste. Some veterans say the drugs left them with long-term psychological and physical problems, while the ADF maintains the trials were conducted within the required ethical and legal guidelines at the time. Retired Major Stuart McCarthy was one former soldier who claims he experienced severe side effects after taking the drugs. He now heads the support group, the Crinoline Veterans and Families Association. Welcome to breakfast.
Morning, Hamish. How are you?
Very well, thank you. You were given both of these drugs while in the ADF. When and where, and what were the implications for you?
Well, in my case, Hamish, I deployed to Bougainville in Papua New Guinea. That was in 1999. At the end of that deployment, I was involved in a clinical trial of the experimental drug tafe, which you mentioned before. In that trial, we were given tafe at quite high doses. And even before we talk about the adverse reactions from this particular drug, one interesting part of the properties of this drug is that for many of us, myself included, we don't metabolise this drug properly, so it doesn't actually work against malaria.
Right.
So in my case, I contracted vivax malaria anyway. I was quite ill from that. But to get back to the adverse effects of these drugs, 2 years after I was involved in that clinical trial of tafe, I then deployed to a UN peacekeeping mission in Africa in 2001, where I was given mefloquine. And so if you put all of that into context, between the deployment to Bougainville and then, as you mentioned before, to Timor-Leste, there were a total of almost 3,000 of us were given mefloquine and or tafe during the ADF clinical trials that we're talking about.
What did they tell you about what you were taking?
Well, tafe, we weren't given very much information at all, certainly as far as the potential side effects of that particular drug. In fact, I recall being told that it was already in use in the US military, which I've since discovered just was not correct at all. The other very distressing thing that I've found more recently is that there's now 7 decades of evidence relating to this particular class of drug, the 8 aminoquinolines that show that it can cause permanent brain damage. That information and published research goes right back to the Second World War, where there was a dedicated screening program conducted by the US government where they tested a series of these particular 8 aminoquinolines, and they found very extensive evidence using animal models, in particular primates, that found that this drug or this class of drug can cause permanent brain damage.
And what was it about the symptoms that indicated to you individually that this might be linked to the anti-malarials, and it wasn't something like PTSD, which obviously is commonly experienced for many soldiers returning from service?
That's right. That's a very good question. In my case, I personally have experienced depression, anxiety, hearing problems, dizziness, and also some quite distinctive cognitive problems. So I have with my working memory and concentration. So to get back to the point you made, there is published research now which shows that the symptoms that we've experienced from this type of brain damage can be confounded. It's a confounder of post-traumatic stress disorder, but with us, though, it's the combination of neurological, physical, and some of those psychiatric symptoms which do make this quite distinctive from post-traumatic stress disorder.
And what would it mean to you, given the struggle you've had both with the government but also the department and the Defence Force itself, to have a Senate inquiry as is now being promised?
I think a Senate inquiry would be a very good start. We have been calling for a Royal Commission because we believe there's quite extensive evidence now of criminal misconduct on the part of the senior members of the Australian Defence Force. And that involves things like breaches of the Therapeutic Goods Act relating to the conduct of the original trials. I also believe there was criminal negligence involved, given that there wasn't proper testing on animal models prior to the conduct of these clinical trials. And then even I believe there's been systematic fraud because the published results of the drug trials that we've read just bear no resemblance whatsoever to our experience of those trials. But to get back to the Senate inquiry, though, I think it's a very good, positive first step. I think it will achieve two things. Firstly, it will, just as you alluded to before, there's been a great deal of misinformation and even, I believe, deceit as far as the information about these drugs coming from Defence. So the inquiry will be able to cut through that misinformation and establish what the key facts are as to what the devastating impact that these drugs have had on so many of us. But the other thing, and I think most importantly, is that it will help to identify what the urgent medical needs are for both the veterans who are directly involved in the drug trials and given mefloquine beyond those drug trials, and also the support needs of their families. The other thing, though, I think a point that's worth making is that the federal government doesn't need to wait for the Senate inquiry to give us the sort of urgent medical help that we need and the other support that we need. I think it's reached the stage now that we can come together and sit down with the Minister Chester, who we've reached out to, and sit down also with the support that we have from the federal opposition and come to a good, solid, bipartisan consensus on what support we need and get cracking with that straight away. The biggest problem that we've had is, as you said yourself, and as I mentioned before, is just the misinformation that's been coming out of Defence, in particular from the Surgeon General of the Defence Force. And I think it's reached a stage now where, in order to be able to sit down and work with the federal government, it's reached a stage where I think the Surgeon General probably should be stood down and the government could appoint a doctor who's more capable of working with us and pulling together a team of the right medical experts, people with expertise in brain injury, neurotoxicology, because they're the ones who need to take a leading role in bringing together and putting together the sort of support package that we need to see.
Stuart McCarthy, we will have to leave it there. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you so much, Hamish.
Retired Major Stuart McCarthy is President of the Quinolene Veterans and Families Association.